The passing 6/4 chord is going to be the last 6/4 chord that we talk about. Remember in lecture 9 we did the cadential 6/4. In lecture 10 we talked about the pedal or neighboring 6/4. In lecture 11 we talked about the arpeggiating 6/4. And now we're completing that little adventure with the passing 6/4. This is another good technique. It's often used in counterpoint to create a voice exchange. And there is an instance where it is referred to as a pedal 6/4 when one of the notes stays stationary in the bass. And I will talk about that in this lecture. So typically it moves from a root position to a 6/4 chord to an inverted chord. So if we look at this first example here, we have a 1 chord. It goes to a 6/4 chord that allows for stepwise passing motion into the final 1/6 chord. And it can go from a 1 to a 1/6 or a 1/6 back to a 1. You can also go from a 4/6 to a 4 chord or a 1/6 to a 1 chord. I've even seen it move from a 5 to a 5/6 chord. All of these are options, but what happens is when you move by step, there's going to be a voice exchange in one of the voices. So a voice exchange, very important concept in music. Notice here's your C, it exchanges with the C here. Here's your E, it exchanges with the E here. That voice exchange is pretty important to the passing 6/4. And it really helps to create the sound of the passing 6/4. Whenever you have a voice exchange, like we have in that first measure, you notice that middle chord, it just sounds a little weak because of the octave sound, but then it resolves to a thicker harmony. So then when you add the remaining voices, you get something like this. You start on this nice stable 1 chord, you move in, and then back to the resolution. So notice what's happening in the soprano. Leading tone resolving. Notice what's happening in the alto. Common tone staying in one place. Now if that is in the bass, some theorists will call that a pedal 6/4. But that still doesn't really accurately reflect the function of the passing 6/3 because the characteristic feature, the feature that really stands out is this passing motion. So this is a very important chord progression. It's often used to expand a tonic or a predominant or even a dominant area. Typically you're going to see it most commonly in the tonic area. And if you see a 1, a 5/6/4 going to a 1/6, you know that's not a cadence. You know that that's just a passing 6/4 chord. It can actually help you to identify the phrase because you typically don't see this passing 6/4 chord moving into an actual cadence. Like here we have a 5 chord going to a 1 chord. Remember, anytime you have a 6/4 chord, I will say this again and again, anytime you have a 6/4 chord in classical romantic style music, it's serving a function. It's acting as part of a larger device. In this case, it's a passing 6/4. So if you see that 6/4 chord, you're positive there's a second inversion chord in a piece you're analyzing. Look at the area before and after. Try and figure out if it's using any of these techniques that we're going to be talking about as I go through all these lessons. It can help you to explain why that 6/4 chord is there in the first place. So there are a few ways we can write this. Typically 1 goes to 1/6, like you see here. The 4 goes to a 4/6, or the 4/6 comes up to a 4 in root position. So it's either going from a first inversion to a root position triad with a passing chord in between, or it's going from a root position triad to a first inversion chord with that passing chord in between. It's going to be one of these two options here. The only one that is only allowed going one way, and I always love saying allowed because, you know, theory is just a theory, but moving from the 4/6 to the 2/6. Typically, and this is something that you're going to learn, hopefully it's starting to become more familiar, but that 4 chord, if we're in the key of C, this is an F major chord. We've got an F, an A, and a C. If you have a 2 chord, D, F, A, typically you'll have that stronger chord, the 4 chord, come before the weakened chord. And then you'll typically put that weakened chord in first inversion. So you typically don't go from a 2 chord to a 4 chord. And that's why this particular progression only goes from 4/6 to 2/6. And it has to go from a 4/6 to a 2/6 in order to have that passing motion. If you think about it, your F major chord, F, A, and C, you're going to have an A as the bass note if you put it in first inversion. And then if you have a D, F, and an A, then you're going to have the F as the bass note for the 2 chord in first inversion. So that allows you to just move down from the A and resolve to the 3rd of the 2 chord. That's why it only occurs from a 4/6 to a 2/6 if you're using that predominant to 2 motion. So here are some basic guidelines that'll just kind of help you out with the passing 6/4. It uses passing tones between 2 chords. So typically you go from a 1 to a 1/6 or a 1/6 to a 1. And that will naturally create this 6/4 chord motion if you fill in the chord tones between the 2 chords. The 4/6 to the 1/6/4 can go to a 4, or you can substitute the 2/6 chord. So it's possible to connect chords that belong to the same functional area as long as you can create that stepwise motion in the bass or in one of the voices if you want to make it more of like a pedal 6/4 chord. So here are a few more examples. So this is how you're going to actually write the passing 6/4. Choose the tonic, the dominant, or the subdominant chord that you want to use to prolong the tonal area. That's the first step. And then you can just write a 6/4 chord in between. Then you create a root position and a first inversion chord placed on either side of the passing chord. So here's a root position chord and here's a first inversion chord. It's placed on either side of the passing chord. Same thing here. We're going from first inversion to root position. First inversion to root position. First inversion to root position. Then you make sure that you write a voice exchange. So it needs to occur between the bass most commonly and an upper part. So what happens here is we got a voice exchange right here in the first chord. Voice exchange here occurs between the bass and the soprano. Here, the voice exchange occurs between the bass and the tenor. And then here again between the soprano and the bass. So you'll end up with a doubled fifth of the passing triad. This just occurs naturally when you create that 6/4 chord with a voice exchange. So if we look at this, a 5/6/4 in the key of C would be G, B, D. So the D, which is a fifth of the 5 chord, is actually doubled because of that passing motion. So then you just fill in the skips with 2 passing tones. So as we've already done. And there should be 1 neighbor tone. So it usually goes from the tone that you can't keep as a common tone. So here we've got our tonic going to a leading tone back to the tonic. Here same thing, tonic, leading tone, tonic. And then with the 4/6/4 we still have neighboring motion, but it's actually between the root of the 4 chord and then you go down to the E and you just come back up to the root. And then you'll notice that all 3 of these also have a common tone. So the G is held, the G is held, the C is held, and the G is held. So if you just follow these basic rules, you can write a passing 6/4 chord pretty easily. Most important thing, remember to write in the bass line using stepwise motion going from a root position to a first inversion triad, and then make sure that you keep the common tone when possible, and then make sure you include some neighboring motion, and that's all there is to it. Now, passing chords can also be done with 7ths. If you want to do that, then you just follow the basic voice leading rules. Make sure that 7th resolves down. If there's a leading tone, it resolves up. And you can also write a passing 6/4 using a 7th chord. So in that case, it would be called a passing 4/3. But we'll actually talk about those a little bit later. I hope this was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions.